A whisper lingers in the ashes of a cold fireplace, a secret nearly lost to flame and silence. What begins as a quiet inheritance soon unravels into a web of forged truths, veiled identities, and a daughter's defiant act of love. Behind every tear-streaked letter and unopened door lies a motive more human than cruel. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on a leaden morning in early April of the year 1893 that I found myself once more seated opposite my old friend in the familiar drawing room of Baker Street. The fire crackled faintly, attempting in vain to chase the chill which had crept into the bones of the city. Rain streaked the windows in persistent slants, and the scent of damp wool hung in the air. Holmes had not spoken for some time, his keen eyes buried in the pages of the Times. I knew the look well, not the blankness of idleness, but the intense stillness of calculation. As ever, it was not the headlines that held his interest, but the obituaries. "Curious," Holmes murmured at last, one finger pausing midway down a column. He turned the paper and laid it flat before him. "Observe, Watson. Godfrey Pellingham, merchant baron of some repute, buried yesterday at Kensal Green, 4 widows in attendance. And yet," he tapped a smaller item, buried beneath the shipping forecasts. "One observer reports 5 women in mourning, all heavily veiled, all silent. No 5th wife appears on record." He leaned back, fingertips pressed together. "There, I think, lies a matter which deserves our attention more than the doings of any German chancellor." I could not help but smile. Surely, Holmes, it was a mistake, a mourner in black who came for another ceremony, or some relation unknown to the press. He arched an eyebrow. "My dear Watson, when a man has had 4 wives and a fortune worth contesting, a 5th woman draped in mystery is seldom accidental." He returned to the newspaper. The world hides its secrets not in vaults, but in graveyards and gossip. Let us see which this turns out to be. Outside, the rain began to ease. There came then the sound of quick steps ascending the stairs. Hesitant at first, but gathering momentum, Mrs. Hudson's voice was heard in muffled tones. Followed by the creak of our sitting-room door, a man entered, removing his hat with a hand that trembled slightly. His coat was soaked through, his moustache dripping, and the skin beneath his eyes bore that unmistakable pallor of a man deeply troubled. "Mr. Holmes?" he inquired, though it was plain he already knew the answer. Holmes did not rise, but gestured politely to the vacant chair by the hearth. "You have chosen a most atmospheric day for your visit, sir. May I offer you a towel?" The man declined with a shake of the head and sat stiffly. I observed him carefully, the fine cut of his coat, now water-stained, the faint streak of ink upon his left cuff, a trace of cologne that lingered oddly floral. "I am Avery Melthorpe," he said at last, "solicitor to the estate of the late Mr. Godfrey Pellingham." Holmes said nothing, but his eyes gleamed with interest beneath half-lowered lids. Mr. Melthorpe seemed to weigh his words before speaking again. "Mr. Holmes, I was told that you could be trusted to act discreetly in matters of a delicate nature." Holmes offered no reassurance, only the silence that demands revelation. "There was something irregular, sir, at the funeral yesterday. Something that none of us can explain." He hesitated again. "And this morning, I discovered that the will, Mr. Pellingham's will, has gone missing from my locked drawer." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Ah," he said softly, "then we are indeed dealing with 5 widows, and one invisible hand." I had seen many men cross the threshold of 221B Baker Street in various states of distress, but few so outwardly composed and yet inwardly unravelled as Mr. Avery Melthorpe. His movements bore the stiffness of habit, yet his fingertips drummed the arm of his chair with a rhythm he did not seem aware of. Holmes, in contrast, sat relaxed, legs crossed, fingers steepled, as though receiving a gentleman caller rather than a man teetering on the edge of panic. "You have the look," Holmes said dryly, "of a man who dines daily with discretion and now finds his supper disturbed." Melthorpe managed a half-smile but said nothing. He reached into his coat, withdrew a handkerchief, and dabbed his brow. I noticed he did not meet Holmes's eyes, a small but telling omission in one who is paid to read truth from contracts. "I am not a superstitious man, Mr. Holmes," Melthorpe began at last, his voice low but clear. "But yesterday at Kensal Green, something occurred which I find impossible to explain by ordinary means." He paused, fingers tightening around the handle of his umbrella. "Godfrey Pellingham, as you may know, was married 4 times. Each of his wives survived him, and each attended his funeral." Holmes gave a slow nod. "4 mourning veils," he said, "and yet a 5th was observed." Melthorpe looked up sharply. "Then you have already read it." "Buried in the fine print of the Times," Holmes replied. "An unnamed 5th widow, not listed in the record, and not known to the family?" "Precisely. I inquired discreetly afterward. None of the 4 recognized her, nor did any of the household staff. She stood at the edge, apart from the rest, then disappeared before the service concluded." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and I saw the familiar gleam return. "Ghosts seldom leave footprints," he murmured. "But this one, I suspect, wore boots." I leaned forward. "You say she disappeared, but surely someone attempted to speak with her." Melthorpe shook his head. "She arrived just before the first psalm, took her place to the left of the main mourners, and remained entirely silent. Her attire was proper, her movements graceful, and her posture, I hesitate to say it, almost reverent." He seemed embarrassed by the word. "She kept her veil drawn. When the final benediction began, she slipped away into the crowd before anyone could intercept her." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And yet she mourned, or appeared to. That is no accident." "Indeed," said Melthorpe, "and if that were all, I might have left it to idle curiosity. But this morning brought a second, far more troubling discovery." Melthorpe hesitated once more, glancing between Holmes and myself. "You understand, of course," he said slowly, "that I speak now as a man under professional obligation, one which I have already compromised by merely being here." Holmes waved a hand. "Discretion is the air we breathe at Baker Street, Mr. Melthorpe. Proceed." The solicitor took a breath. "The last will and testament of Mr. Godfrey Pellingham was executed 6 weeks prior to his death and deposited, sealed and initialed, in the bottom drawer of my private filing cabinet. That cabinet remained locked. Only my clerk and I possess keys." "And the clerk?" Holmes asked. "Out of town. He has been in Cheltenham since Friday last." "And yet the will?" "Gone," Melthorpe said simply. "The lock undamaged, no sign of forced entry, nothing else disturbed." I frowned. Could it have been misfiled? Impossible. I checked the entire office twice, as did my junior partner. It is no longer in the building. Holmes closed his eyes for a brief moment. "A 5th mourner," he murmured, "and now a vanishing will. We are not dealing with grief, Dr. Watson. We are dealing with intention." Holmes uncrossed his legs and rose with casual elegance. He paced once, then stopped directly beside Melthorpe. The solicitor shifted uncomfortably. "You've had a trying morning, sir," Holmes said quietly. "I note you dressed in haste. Your shirt collar is misaligned by nearly a 1/4 inch. The ink smudge on your sleeve suggests a nervous hand rather than a working one, and your left cuff button is missing entirely, though you strike me as meticulous." Melthorpe blinked. "I had not noticed." "More interesting," Holmes continued, "is the fragrance that lingers faintly. Not yours, I think. Something floral, artificial, and quite out of place for this weather." Melthorpe flushed slightly, but said nothing. Holmes turned back to the fire. "The question, then, is not who stole the will, but who had a reason to ensure its contents were never known, and who was close enough, familiar enough, to act with such confidence." He paused. Mr. Melthorpe, I must now ask you to speak not only as solicitor, but as man." Melthorpe's cheeks coloured further, and he looked to the hearth as though it might offer escape. "It was not a liaison," he said, perhaps too quickly. "A friendship, no more." Holmes offered a half-smile. "A friendship with one of the widows?" "Widow Martha Pellingham," Melthorpe admitted after a pause. "We became acquainted during the weeks following Mr. Pellingham's illness. She is considerably younger than the others, and quite alone." "Alone," Holmes repeated, "except perhaps when visiting your chambers." "Holmes!" I exclaimed, shocked at the bluntness. "My dear Watson," he replied without turning, "when a man's coat carries perfume not found in any gentleman's club, and his morning collar is fastened in a mirror not his own, one may reasonably deduce companionship." Melthorpe looked both mortified and relieved. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes, I had nothing to gain from the disappearance of the will." "On the contrary," said Holmes, "you had everything to lose, if it revealed something the youngest widow preferred to keep buried." I confess I felt a distinct tightening in my chest at the implications. That a solicitor, a man sworn to professional integrity, would involve himself with the bereaved widow of a powerful client struck me as bordering on impropriety. Holmes, of course, seemed altogether untroubled. He had long since abandoned the illusions of Victorian rectitude, preferring instead to catalogue human frailty with scientific dispassion. "Love," he had once told me, "is merely an arrangement of circumstance and proximity, but rarely a companion of logic." I could only sigh. The world, it seemed, had changed beneath my feet, while I remained tethered to the rules of decency. Holmes moved to the window, hands behind his back. "We are not, I think, pursuing a thief," he said at length, "but a curator, someone who feared the contents of that document enough to remove it, not for profit, but for silence." He turned, eyes bright. "It is a case not of burglary, but of forgery, and of feminine design." Melthorpe looked up. "Then you believe she—" "Oh yes," Holmes said calmly. "And what is more, the fifth widow has not vanished. She is very much among us still. We need only draw her into the light." And with that, the game was truly afoot. The Pellingham estate sat on the edge of Holland Park like a tomb with drapes. Though the spring air outside had begun to soften, within the house a chill lingered. Not of climate, but of mood. Holmes had suggested we present ourselves as assisting Mr. Melthorpe with estate matters, and so we arrived not as detectives, but as curious shadows dressed in civility. The butler received us with the sort of professionalism one acquires only after years in service to ungrateful families. He led us through halls filled with ancestral portraits, none of which, Holmes noted with the twitch of an eyebrow, bore the features of any woman. "4 wives, and none preserved," he murmured. "An oversight or an intention, Watson?" I shrugged, though I could not suppress a shiver. The house felt not merely bereaved, but suspicious, as though its very woodwork was holding something back. As we reached the parlour, where the widows had gathered, Holmes gave his cravat a final adjustment and whispered, "Now, my dear fellow, observe how the living protect the dead." Clara Pellingham received us seated beneath a tall window, a dark veil resting like ivy about her hair. She was the first wife, and though age had lined her face, it had not dulled her eyes. Sharp, grey, and restless, they took in Holmes with a practised swiftness that I could only describe as defensive. "Mr. Melthorpe said you were assisting with the catalogue of papers," she began before Holmes could speak. "Though I wonder what help is needed now, seeing how little there is to distribute." Holmes bowed slightly. "Merely a procedural inquiry, madam. We have been tasked with verifying a number of inconsistencies." "Inconsistencies?" she repeated with a voice like iron fencing. "What inconsistencies?" Holmes smiled. "Only names, madam. For instance, was there any woman present at the funeral who was not known to you?" Her fingers clenched briefly on the chair arm. "I paid no mind to strangers." Ah, said Holmes, a very efficient method of managing grief. Her glare did not waver. When one has been replaced 3 times, Mr. Holmes, one learns not to count who lingers at the grave. Holmes said no more, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Mrs. Agnes Pellingham resided in a small sunroom that smelled faintly of incense and mothballs. Draped in modest black and clutching a well-thumbed prayer book, she greeted us with the tranquil air of one who bore mourning as a form of penance. "It is not my place to question Providence," she said in reply to Holmes's gentle inquiries. "The Lord giveth and taketh away." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, examining the margins of her Bible with quick glances. "And did he giveth or taketh an unknown mourner at the funeral?" "I saw no such person," she said quickly. Too quickly. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "None who lingered apart?" She blinked slowly, then adjusted a bookmark. "There were many unfamiliar faces. I assumed them servants or distant cousins. One mustn't fixate on details when prayer is the proper response." I could sense Holmes preparing a barb, but he abstained. Instead, he studied the brass cross on the table. "You are certain nothing else unusual occurred?" "Only that the music began late," she replied. "But grief confuses schedules." Holmes said nothing, but I could tell he had marked the phrase. Liliane Pellingham, widow number 3, was by far the most dramatic of the quartet. She greeted us in a room filled with deep-coloured tapestries and French porcelain, her black lace shawl artfully draped as though posed for a painting. "Ah, Monsieur Holmes," she sighed, "how dreadful it all is. Death, so final, so unfair, and yet so inevitable," Holmes said, unmoved. She dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, though I could not help noticing the corners remained suspiciously dry. "I remember when Godfrey took me to Venice. He said I was the only woman who truly understood him." Holmes tilted his head. "And yet he married twice more after you, madam." She pouted. "Mistakes. He always came back to my letters." "Did you recognize everyone at the funeral?" I asked. "Of course not. Who can keep track of such bleak affairs? No 5th woman in mourning?" "Perhaps one," she said, and fluttered her lashes. "But then, I was very emotional. Faces were blurred by tears." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "It is remarkable," he said, "how many see least when most compelled to look. We found Martha, the 4th and final widow, in the late Mr. Pellingham's private study, where she sat as still as a statue, her gloves folded neatly in her lap. She was younger than the rest by at least 20 years, and possessed a gaze that neither wavered nor welcomed." Holmes approached with polite reserve. "Madam," he said, "we come not to disturb your grief, but to clarify an administrative matter." "There is nothing I can add," she said coldly. "I was his wife, not his secretary." "Indeed? Still you attended the funeral?" "Of course." "And you noticed no unfamiliar face?" "None worth remembering." Her tone was clipped, almost rehearsed. Holmes leaned slightly forward. "May I inquire where you purchased your shawl?" She blinked. "Why?" "It carries a rather distinct scent. Violet leaf and musk. Parisian, I believe. Rare this time of year." Her lips thinned. "You observe too much." "That is, madam, the unfortunate burden of my profession." And with that, he turned away. But I knew, by the angle of his jaw, that he had taken the measure of her entirely. As the visits concluded, Holmes expressed a casual desire to examine the drawing room, ostensibly for the purpose of confirming which documents the late Mr. Pellingham had kept nearest to hand. The butler, ever obliging, left us for tea preparations, and Holmes knelt almost immediately before the hearth. "Notice the grate," he said quietly. "Ashes not more than 2 days old, though no fire has been lit since the burial." He reached in with his gloved hand and withdrew a curled charred fragment, its edges still brittle. "Paper?" I asked. "Vellum," Holmes corrected. "See the faint border? A watermark, partially burned, but still legible. Government issue. This was not a letter, Watson. This was a legal document. He held it up to the light. And more damning still, the scorch marks are uneven. It was folded when burned. Someone destroyed it in haste. I looked to the empty grate and shivered. And now we know what became of one will, Holmes murmured. The question is, what replaced it? Holmes remained in conversation with a footman just outside the parlour, ostensibly inquiring about Pellingham's habits regarding correspondence and legal papers. Left to my own devices, I allowed curiosity to guide me into the adjacent study, a dimly lit chamber lined with rosewood shelves and the familiar scent of pipe ash and parchment. Upon the far wall hung several portraits, all of considerable age, but one frame drew my attention not for what it displayed, but for its dustless outline. There, where the light struck unevenly, I saw that a painting had recently been removed, or replaced. With a glance to be sure I remained unobserved, I stepped closer and found, tucked behind a side cabinet, a smaller portrait wrapped loosely in cloth. It was a photograph, carefully composed, showing Geoffrey Pellingham standing stiffly beside a woman I did not recognise, and at their feet, a girl of no more than 8 or 9 years, clutching a small bouquet. They were not labelled, no date, no inscription. Yet the woman's face bore a faint resemblance to none of the widow's. A different chapter of his life, it seemed, and one not recorded in the family's visible gallery. I tucked it under my arm and returned to Holmes, whose eyes narrowed at once when he saw what I carried. "You found her," he said, "the widow before the first. We stood later in the garden, beneath the long windows of the south corridor, where ivy had begun to reach for spring but had not yet bloomed." Holmes examined the photograph under the waning light. "This woman," he said, "was not merely a paramour, she was a part of his life, part enough to be photographed alongside his child." He glanced up, and not a single widow acknowledged her existence. "You believe they all know?" I asked. "I believe none of them are fools," he replied. "One, perhaps, knew her directly, another sensed her return, but they are not speaking, and silence, Watson, is its own kind of testimony." "What of the perfume?" I asked. "The violet on Martha's shawl?" He nodded. It was the same as Melthorpe's sleeve. I suspect she did not merely entertain him. She encouraged his loyalty. "And the will?" Holmes tapped the photograph. "She is the threat. Whether alive or through her child, this unknown woman represents a claim, one the others, or at least one, hope to erase." His eyes met mine. "We are not hunting a thief, Watson. We are chasing a name long buried, and someone is determined to keep the grave sealed." It was Holmes who insisted we take a detour the following morning to a little studio off Wandsworth Lane, operated by a rather eccentric gentleman who answered to the name Mr. Telford. The shop, which smelled of varnish and dry chemicals, was cluttered with half-finished sittings and retouched wedding portraits. Holmes wasted no time in presenting the photograph I had uncovered. Telford peered at it with a jeweller's glass, muttering beneath his breath. Yes, my work, no doubt. Taken here must be 6 years ago or more." Holmes leaned forward. "And the subjects?" "Paid in cash. The name on the register was Brent, Eliza Brent. She insisted the child be seated low and no studio name stamped on the reverse." He scratched at his beard. "Unusual request. She said it was for private use only." "Did she return?" Holmes asked. "Once, collected the print, said she would not be photographed again." Holmes nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. "Was there a man with her?" "No, sir, just the girl. Bright little thing, red ribbon in her plait, I recall. Laughed like a bell, that one." Holmes thanked the man and turned to me with a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "We've found our ghost." Back on Baker Street, Holmes laid the photograph gently upon the table, his gaze distant. "Eliza Brent," he said softly. a name that appears nowhere in the registries of Mr. Pellingham's estate, yet one that sits comfortably beside his shoulder in this image. You believe she was his wife? I asked. Not by law, Holmes replied, but by heart and habit, perhaps. The man spent 5 years in Australia during the expansion of his shipping concerns. During that time, he disappeared from polite London society and returned curiously silent about those years. Why conceal her? I pressed. Holmes tapped the table. Pellingham was not a man to dilute his English respectability with scandal. A common law wife and an illegitimate child were simpler buried in distance and time. And now the child returns? I suspect so. The fifth mourner was too composed, too precise. Not a woman broken by loss, but one bound to it. He paused. Eliza Brent is almost certainly dead, Watson. But her daughter is very much alive, and perhaps more dangerous to the estate than any of the widows. That same afternoon, Holmes sent for shipping records through an acquaintance at Lloyd's and received a neat packet delivered by special courier before dusk. He unfolded a manifest with the ease of a man flipping through old friends. Here, he said, tapping the page. The Adelaide Star, departed Melbourne, April 1877. Arrived Plymouth 7 weeks later. Passenger, Mrs. Eleanor Bright, and daughter, Alice. Bright? I said. A coincidence? Hardly, Holmes murmured. Observe the initials match. Eliza Brent becomes Eleanor Bright. A simple substitution to evade inquiry, and yet the daughter's name remains unchanged. Why would she return? I asked. Surely time has erased whatever claim she once had. Holmes shook his head. That is precisely what someone hoped, and why the will disappeared. If the daughter's existence were mentioned, even obliquely, her mere presence could upend everything. And you believe she has come to claim it? I believe, Holmes said, lighting his pipe, that she came first to see what was being stolen, and then to decide whether to let it happen. He exhaled a thin stream of smoke. We are not dealing with grief, Watson. We are dealing with strategy. By the time we retired for the evening, Holmes had already begun to sketch out the contours of a most peculiar theory. You recall how the fifth woman stood apart, he said. Not beside any of the others, not even near the family pew. Yes, I replied, and she left before the final prayer. Because she had seen enough, Holmes concluded. She was not there to mourn, but to observe. You believe she is the daughter? I do. The features are close enough to Eliza Brent's to bear resemblance, but more importantly, the bearing. Poised, silent, deliberate. Not the behaviour of a widow, but of someone calculating. And what does she want? Justice, Holmes said. Or perhaps vindication. She may not even want the estate, only to ensure that what her mother was promised is not buried with her. He stood, adjusting his cuffs. But we must know more. A test, Watson. A whisper of something untrue to see who comes to correct it. And in that moment, I knew Holmes was preparing his net, and that someone would walk straight into it. As I lay that night half sunk in sleep, my mind returned to the funeral and to the strange woman Holmes now believed to be Alice Brent. I could remember little of her, only a soft swish of fabric and a face that turned away when eyes met her own. But there had been something in her gait. Not sorrow, not quite. Rather, resolve. A steadiness that did not waver, even as the others clutched their handkerchiefs and dabbed theatrically at their eyes. I recalled her gloved hands folded neatly before her, and the faintest glint of a locket beneath her collar, gold, oval, catching the light for a mere second. She had stood as one who belonged there by right, and yet unacknowledged. And when she disappeared, it was not the vanishing of a thief, but the quiet withdrawal of someone who knew her moment had not yet come. Holmes was right, I thought, as the street lamps dimmed outside. The fifth widow was no widow at all. She was something far more dangerous, the truth that refuses to stay buried. Back at Baker Street the following afternoon, Holmes paced with that particular energy I'd come to associate with a mind in full flight. He paused only to refill his pipe or to tap at the window with the end of his cane. "It is not theft, Watson," he said at last. "It is guardianship." "The will?" I asked. "Precisely. A person with access to Melthorpe's office, someone familiar enough with its layout and rhythms, removed the original not to profit, but to protect it from replacement." "Then the forgery?" "Executed by one of the widows, most likely Clara, whose composure is too complete, but she needed silence. And the original will, if made known, would have spoken too loudly." He turned abruptly. "But if our ghost, the daughter, intercepted it first, then she possesses the only untainted copy. She waits now to see if she is mentioned or erased." "And your plan?" I asked. Holmes smiled. "We shall create a document that does not exist, announce its discovery, and see who comes to disprove a lie, or reclaim the truth." True to his word, Holmes worked swiftly through a trusted contact at the Pellingham estate. Within the hour, word had begun to trickle through the household, via footman's whisper and errant scrap of letter, that a sealed older will had been found in the drawer of the deceased's writing desk. "It never ceases to amaze me," Holmes said with dry amusement, "how quickly servants can become heralds when given half a secret and a corridor to carry it." By dusk, 2 of the widows had inquired discreetly about legal implications. One requested a private meeting with Mr. Melthorpe. Another sent for a solicitor of her own. But it was the youngest, Martha, who said nothing. "That silence," Holmes remarked, "was more telling than words." "She already knows it is false," he said, "because she never forged that version, which means someone else holds it." "And the daughter?" I asked. "She must act tonight," Holmes replied. "If she truly has the original, she will not let it be buried beneath lies." He rose and fetched his revolver from the drawer. "We shall sit in the dark and wait for a woman who comes not to steal, but to correct." The drawing room at Pellingham House was lit only by the dwindling glow of a coal fire, as Holmes and I settled into position behind the thick velvet curtains which framed the study's entrance. The estate had quieted by 10:30. Only the occasional murmur of boots on floorboards reminded us that the house still breathed. Holmes sat as still as the grave, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his revolver, his eyes half-lidded in perfect calm. I, for my part, could not help the irregular beat of my heart, though I told myself it was the cold that caused my limbs to tremble. And then, just past 11, we heard it. Not the grand intrusion of burglars, but the quiet precision of someone who knew the place well. The click of a latch, the subtle hush of silk upon the carpet, and then the faintest creak of the study door opening. Holmes's hand did not move. "She's punctual," he whispered. "Let us see if her conscience is as precise." The figure moved with such delicacy that I doubted even the mice beneath the skirting boards had noticed her. From our vantage behind the curtain, I could discern only the outline of a woman in a morning dress, slender, poised, her gloved hands working methodically at the drawers of the late Pellingham's desk. Holmes did not speak, but gave me the slightest nod, a signal that the time was near. The woman retrieved something, a folded parchment perhaps, and held it up to the firelight, inspecting the seal. She did not tremble. Indeed, her movements were so composed, so rehearsed, that I felt we were witnessing not a crime, but a ritual. Holmes stepped forward at last, emerging from the shadows with such quiet grace that she gasped only faintly as he addressed her. "Miss Brent," he said, "I believe you have something which does not belong to you, and yet, curiously, is more yours than anyone else's." She turned slowly, unmasked, and for the first time I saw the truth, written not in ink, but in her eyes. It was 2 days later, in the private meeting room of Melthorpe and Pike, that the 4 widows of the late Geoffrey Pellingham were gathered under curious invitation. The pretext, delivered with deliberate urgency, was the discovery of a sealed testament hidden in the drawer of the deceased's desk, now verified by Melthorpe and scheduled for immediate review. Holmes had insisted the reading take place in formal tone, with as much theatricality as Mr. Melthorpe could muster. "People do not reveal themselves in interrogation, Watson," he had murmured. "They reveal themselves when they believe they are actors in a play, with everything to gain or lose." And so, on a damp Thursday morning, the chairs were drawn close and the widows filed in, their black veils as uniform as mourning birds. Holmes stood discreetly to one side, ostensibly an advisor to the estate's administration. I remained seated near the hearth, observing. Clara was first, her stride stiff with suspicion. Agnes followed, clutching her prayer book. Liliane swept in with theatrical sighs, and Martha last, composed but brittle, like glass under pressure. The door was closed, the seal untouched on the envelope upon the table, and yet the true guest of honour had not yet arrived. The room ticked forward in silence, but no clock marked the passing seconds. The ancient mantelpiece timepiece Holmes had noticed earlier had been deliberately stopped. Whether symbolic or mechanical, I could not tell. Mr. Melthorpe cleared his throat and prepared to speak, but before the first syllable had left his lips, the door creaked open once more. She entered without hesitation. No veil, no shawl, no apology. Her morning dress was plain, her eyes steady. She carried no handbag, no gloves, no companion. And yet the effect of her presence was like a stone dropped into still water. Every head turned. Clara stiffened. Agnes blanched. Liliane let slip a soft gasp. And even Martha's usually impassive expression flickered with the faintest recognition. Or was it dread? Holmes gave a small bow. "You are punctual, Miss Brent." She nodded once, then took the empty seat near the window. Not a word had been exchanged beyond the name, and yet the balance in the room shifted. The pretense of formality collapsed in the quiet weight of something long hidden, now made visible. The fifth widow had returned, though she had never truly been one at all. Holmes stepped forward, not with the stern accusation of a constable, but with the calm clarity of a surgeon announcing the location of a bullet. "Ladies," he said, "permit me to introduce Miss Alice Brent, daughter of Eliza Brent, known once to the late Mr. Pellingham as companion and, in all but law, wife." Gasps erupted, some sharp, others muted by disbelief. Clara half rose from her chair. "This is outrageous!" Holmes held up a hand. "Allow me to continue. Miss Brent has made no formal claim, has not disturbed your grief, and has acted with greater restraint than most might given her position." Agnes made the sign of the cross. Liliane covered her mouth. Martha stared at the envelope on the table as if willing it to vanish. Holmes turned to Alice. "Miss Brent, I believe you removed the original will from Mr. Melthorpe's office. May I ask why?" She looked at him calmly. "Because I feared what would replace it." There was a pause, heavy and crackling. "You did not intend to destroy it." "No," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "I intended to return it, once I knew it would not be buried." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Then perhaps, Miss Brent, you are the only one in this room who has acted entirely without deceit." She spoke without trembling, though I could see the pale imprint of pressure along the edge of her sleeves, where her hands had clenched tightly just moments before. "My mother," she said quietly, "never asked for recognition. She knew what she was to him and what she was not allowed to be. But he wrote to her, he sent money, and once, after his first wife died, he said he would change his will." Her gaze moved across the widows, not with hatred, but with weariness. "When he fell ill again, she wrote to him. He did not answer." Clara shifted uneasily in her seat. Holmes said nothing. "I came to the funeral only to see," Alice continued. "I did not plan to act, but when I heard that the will was missing and that a new one had appeared, I knew someone was burying the past with him. Holmes nodded slowly. You removed the document not to claim his fortune, but to preserve his word. She met his gaze. And to stop a lie from replacing a promise. Holmes turned then, not to Alice, but to the envelope still resting upon the table. Mr. Melthorpe, would you be so kind as to open the document you received? He asked. Melthorpe hesitated. Not from doubt, I think, but from the sense that the play had reached its climax. He slit the seal, unfolded the parchment, and read it silently. Holmes walked slowly to the window. I took the liberty of examining the contents last night. A curious thing struck me. He gestured. Watson, do you recall the scent clinging to the hearth rug? Violet, I said. And burnt paper. Precisely. And the ashes contained remnants of vellum, high-quality legal stock used only for wills and deeds. But the current document, he tapped it lightly, is composed not of vellum, but of common writing paper. He turned his gaze upon Clara. And the ink, madam. That too told a tale. Not the dark carbon ink used by Mr. Melthorpe's office, but a softer brownish shade. Identical, I might add, to the kind you use in your private correspondence. A vial of which was left uncorked on your escritoire. Clara's colour faded, Holmes's tone sharpened, ever so slightly. The will you produced is not merely suspicious, it is forged. Clara stood. You have no proof. I have your hand, Holmes replied. In every loop and flourish of this signature, you did not need to break into the solicitor's cabinet. You only needed to rewrite what the law had already sealed. Silence followed. Then slowly, Alice reached into her satchel and drew forth a sealed parchment, soot-smeared but unbroken. The real one, she said softly, and not a soul in the room dared question it. Clara Pellingham did not deny it outright. She was too clever for that. But her first impulse, like that of many cornered animals, was defiance. I acted only for the good of the estate, she said coldly, though her fingers twisted the corner of her handkerchief until it frayed. That girl had no legal standing, no name, no recognition. Godfrey was not of sound mind. Holmes did not raise his voice. A curious sentiment for a woman who had barely spoken to her husband in his final weeks. She flushed a dull crimson. You presume, I observe, Holmes corrected, that you visited his chamber only once and briefly, that you asked after the study key and were seen burning papers in the drawing room, that you corresponded not with Melthorpe, but with an unlicensed scrivener in Wapping. Her eyes darted to the solicitor, who had gone rather pale. Forgery is an act of desperation, madam, Holmes continued softly. But desperation cannot unmake a daughter. There was a long pause. Clara's posture wilted, her mask collapsing beneath the weight of accumulated truth. Her voice, when it came, was low and edged with bitterness. He promised me, too, she whispered. But his promises were wind. Holmes inclined his head, not in sympathy but in acknowledgement. Then you should have let them scatter, Mrs. Pellingham, not bottled them in ink. Alice sat motionless for a moment longer. Then with careful fingers, she reached into the side pocket of her handbag and produced a folded parchment. It was creased, the edge singed slightly along one side, and the seal, though cracked, bore the unmistakable crest of the Pellingham house, an ivy-wrapped pillar, waxed in crimson. She offered it without ceremony. Melthorpe received it with the air of a man who has just seen his own obituary postponed. He laid it flat upon the table, adjusted his spectacles, and read. Then he exhaled, not loudly, but with unmistakable finality. There is no question, he said. This is the original, witnessed by myself and the late Reverend Halliday, dated 6 months before Mr. Pellingham's passing. He names Miss Alice Brent as his lawful heir to 1/3 of the estate. Silence followed, more complete than any I'd yet experienced in that house. Agnes whispered a prayer. Liliane blinked rapidly and looked away. Martha simply bowed her head, and Clara, though pale, did not speak again. Holmes turned to Alice. You carried it in your bag all this time. She nodded. He wrote it for me. I could not let it burn. And for the first time, she looked not defiant, but quietly sad. Clara rose without warning, the motion sharp, her veil falling askew as she turned toward the door. I'll not be part of this farce, she said. But she had not taken 3 steps when Holmes moved. Not quickly, not forcefully, but precisely. He turned, one hand extended toward the doorframe, the other tucked behind his back like a schoolmaster about to reprimand a wayward pupil. Mrs. Pellingham, he said softly, did you know that lavender ink fades when exposed to fire, but never quite disappears? She froze, her back to us, spine taut as wire. I found traces, Holmes continued, on the burned page in the drawing room, traces that matched the tone in your ink pot, Thomas, and not the solicitor's, a careless oversight perhaps, or merely the haste of a guilty conscience. She stood motionless. Holmes did not advance. He simply lowered his hand. Truth, he said, rarely knocks. It waits in silence for the guilty to trip over it. She sat down again, not gracefully, but with the collapse of a woman who had reached the end of her invention. The rest, as Holmes might have said, was administrative. Melthorpe, restored to his professional bearings, confirmed the will's details. Copies were ordered. Arrangements began. Holmes, disinclined to linger, offered Alice a brief, courteous bow and turned toward the vestibule. Outside, the wind had risen and pressed soft branches against the windows, as though even nature wished to draw the curtain on the sordid scene. Alice, before we could depart, stepped forward. I never wanted their money, she said. Holmes inclined his head slightly. And yet you will take it. She smiled faintly. To give some to my mother's sisters, and the rest, perhaps something honest, books, a school, a quiet place. Holmes's expression did not change, but I have learned to read the slightest inflections of his eyes. Good, he said. That would honour him more than the perfume and pretense that have filled this house. As we walked along the gravel path away from Pellingham House, I glanced sideways at Holmes. You weren't angry, I remarked. Not even when she lied. She was not the villain, Watson, he replied. Only the final custodian of a truth others tried to erase. I would rather spare a quiet thief who seeks to restore than pardon a respectable woman who burns the truth for vanity's sake. He paused. Besides, justice, like ink, seeps through, however one tries to blot it. I made no reply, but I felt the weight of the case settle over me, like ash that refuses to lift. And as we reached Baker Street once more, Holmes was already reaching for his violin. It was late when we returned to Baker Street, but Holmes showed no sign of fatigue. The familiar armchair welcomed him like an old adversary now bested, and within moments the fire crackled anew. I fetched my notebook more out of habit than intention, but Holmes, in one of his rare reflective moods, began speaking without prompt. There is a particular satisfaction, Watson, he said, in observing our deception unravels itself once a single thread is pulled. This case, though not one of my most dangerous, was delicate, like handling cobwebs without tearing them. I watched the smoke from his pipe drift into idle spirals. It was her stillness, you know, not Clara's noise, nor Agnes's prayers, nor the solicitor's pomp. It was Alice Brent's silence that first drew my interest. Guilt clings, grief settles, but silence, true silence, often guards a fact more valuable than gold. I made a note of the phrase. She waited until the right moment, Holmes mused, and when confronted, she did not bluff or plead. She revealed. And Clara? I asked. She concealed, he replied. But ink, Watson, ink never lies. There was a gleam in his eye that matched the glow of the hearth. The game, clearly, was not just played. It had been won. Geoffrey Pellingham, Holmes continued, was a man of contradiction, Sentimental, yet secretive. He left no journal, no photographs of Alice's mother. And yet he signed a will acknowledging her child, leaving her a third of his estate. That is sentiment, Watson, not mere legality. You said she was the daughter of his first love. Indeed, Holmes replied. A woman named Margaret Brent, known only in parish records and a single faded letter in Melthorpe's archive, one which Pellingham had asked never be delivered. He had loved her, it seems, but feared the scandal. His marriage to Clara was one of arrangement, not affection. Then Alice was concealed, shielded, Holmes corrected. She grew up in Dorset under her mother's name, but when word of Pellingham's illness reached them, Margaret sent Alice to London. The girl arrived too late to speak to him, but not too late to receive what he had left behind. In the drawer, he trusted more than his relatives. I remembered the parchment, sooty and creased. She took it for safekeeping. She took it, Holmes said, because she feared what Clara would do, and rightly. The fire told us that. And yet she returned it, I murmured. Yes, he said, tapping the ash from his pipe. She returned it with more honour than those who bore his name. Holmes reached for a sheaf of notes from the mantel and handed them to me. I had these observations jotted during our second visit, he said. Take particular note of the ink. I examined the parchment he indicated. The signature differs, I noted. It's darker. Precisely, Holmes said. The forgery was executed with iron gall ink, commonly sold in stationers frequented by women, notably the one on Brampton Street, where Clara maintains an account. The rest of the document was in the solicitor's fountain blue. The contrast would be invisible to the untrained eye, but not to one acquainted with the chemistry of deception. He rose and paced slowly. And there was the scent, lilac perfume, faint but persistent, not present in any of Melthorpe's things, nor in the study itself. But Clara's letters to her cousin, found among the solicitor's correspondence, bore the same unmistakable trace. She signed a legal document in a different ink, and sealed it herself? I asked. She signed it late at night, Holmes said, after retrieving a discarded parchment from the solicitor's wastebasket. She copied the phrasing with care, but not the soul. The seal was pressed with a substitute stamp, similar but flawed in curvature. He turned back to the fire. Forgery, my dear Watson, is never only a crime of ink. It is a crime of scent, of silence, and of vanity. I observed her, Holmes said, on the day of the funeral. Alice? I asked. Yes, standing at the back, no veil, no tears, only composure. She held her gloves too tightly, a sure sign of tension, but she did not step forward when Clara made her procession. That restraint intrigued me. You suspected her then? I suspected nothing, Holmes replied, but I became curious. She watched not the casket, but the mourners, as if weighing them, as if deciding who among them might burn a will, and who might bend the law to keep it hidden. He paused. She came not to grieve, but to judge, and when she saw what she feared, she acted, but with subtlety. No accusations, no hysteria. She waited, and when the forged will was read aloud, she remained silent still, until our little ruse with the second document flushed the guilty out. I could not help but admire the nerve. She was, in her own way, I said, very like you. Holmes looked up. She is better than I, he said, for I have never had to forgive in order to reveal the truth. It was, curiously enough, my own bumbling foot that disturbed the edge of the hearthrug that day, revealing not gold nor treasure, but a crisp fragment of scorched vellum, which Holmes examined with the same reverence another man might reserve for a relic. Your inadvertent clumsiness may prove more useful than my 2 days of careful observation, he had remarked, holding the singed corner of parchment to the light. Though the ink had largely blistered away, the remnant bore the unmistakable tale of the signature, Godfrey Pellingham's own. Someone, Holmes murmured, tried very hard to make this vanish. Later, it was the discovery of the photograph, wedged behind a portrait of Pellingham and tilted ever so slightly, that confirmed what Holmes had begun to suspect. It was Watson, not I, who drew it forward, exposing the image of a younger Pellingham with a woman whose features bore a striking resemblance to Miss Alice Brent. The edges were yellowed, and the ink on the back, faded but legible, simply read, Margaret, Chichester, 1868. This, Holmes said with quiet finality, is not a mystery of greed, Watson. It is a puzzle of concealment. He placed the photograph beside the charred paper with the delicacy of a man reassembling a broken promise. The common error, Holmes observed, is to presume that concealment implies guilt, but Alice Brent concealed not for gain, but for fear of its opposite. He tapped the worn handle of his pipe thoughtfully. She understood, perhaps better than any of the others, what Clara was capable of. And when she saw the elder widow's hands tremble as the solicitor approached the study, Alice suspected that something had already been taken, or would be. She hid the will? I asked. She rescued it, Holmes replied, before it could be destroyed. The fireplace confirmed her fears. She kept it close, not knowing when or if she would need to produce it, and all the while wrestling with the burden of when truth becomes more dangerous than silence. I was struck, as always, by Holmes' capacity to discern not merely actions but motives, the shadow behind the gesture. She walked a narrow line, Watson. Had Clara succeeded, the world would call Alice an impostor. And yet, had she acted too early, she might have appeared no better than a claimant. Her silence was both her shield and her prison. Holmes looked toward the window, where the dusk deepened like ink in water. And in the end, he said, it was the quietest hand that turned the loudest key. There are moments, dear reader, when even a medical man must admit that character can be as diagnostic as fever. Alice Brent's composure throughout the affair, a calm not born of detachment, but of dignified resolve, had moved me more than I had anticipated. She had neither pleaded nor postured. Her silence had not been weakness, but a kind of moral economy. Holmes, for his part, remained as ever the calculating logician, and yet I fancied a certain gentleness in his tone when he'd spoken to her. Not approval, certainly not sentiment, but something akin to respect. She was never our client, I remarked to him. No, Holmes agreed, but she was the only one who behaved as though truth mattered more than comfort. I could not argue. In a matter that had begun with forgeries, faint perfume trails, and legal fictions, it had ended, improbably, with justice served not by courts, but by conscience. And as I set down my pen that evening, I wondered whether, in the world Holmes and I often walked, it was not the hand that accused, but the one that held fast in silence, that was truly brave. The matter, Holmes predicted, and rightly, would never reach the scandal pages. Melthorpe, ever anxious about his firm's reputation, ensured that the revised documents were signed with quiet efficiency, and Clara Pellingham withdrew from London society under the vague pretence of nervous collapse. Alice received not merely her third, but the full gratitude of those who might never know how close they had come to familial disgrace. She left Baker Street with neither fuss nor flourish. The photograph of her mother returned to her possession, and her eyes reflecting a depth neither Holmes nor I could properly define. "Will you keep in touch with her?" I asked Holmes afterwards. He merely raised an eyebrow. "I imagine she is wise enough not to seek further adventures, Watson. That in itself is admirable." We returned once more to our accustomed silence. The fire hissed, the fog pressed against the panes, and Holmes, producing his violin, played a low and wandering phrase that seemed, for once, less about logic and more about what lay quietly beneath it. The final note, in a case solved not with thunder, but with grace. The lamps had been lit some time before I noticed that the rain had at last abated, retreating from the panes with a sort of weary reluctance. Baker Street had fallen into its customary hush, the clatter of hooves softened by the lingering damp. Within, the fire smouldered in the grate, yet the tea I had poured for Holmes remained untouched. He sat angled toward the hearth, his hands steepled before his mouth, and his gaze fixed on a point somewhere between the mantel and infinity. In that pose, he seemed carved from the same marble as thought itself. I had seen him thus before, after a case closed but not forgotten. There was in his posture no triumph, only the sediment of resolution, the peculiar stillness that comes after the unravelling of a knot long thought intractable. "You see, Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice low and measured, "the logic of a matter may expose a forgery, a signature, a scrap of ash, but logic alone never touches the heart of a case. For that, one must understand what lies beneath the veil." He gestured toward the embers with a languid hand. Clara Pellingham forged out of fear and desperation, but Alice Brent, she acted not to deceive, but to preserve. She was not a thief, nor a schemer. She was, above all else, a daughter. There was a pause in which the coals shifted gently. Even the cleverest of men, he added, might miss the quiet justice of such an act were he to rely solely on deduction. I nodded, absorbing the rare confession. It was not often Holmes admitted the role of feeling, but when he did, it rang true as any verdict rendered by court or crown. Holmes rose to refill his pipe, and as he struck the match against the side of the tin, he glanced toward me with a flicker of that familiar sardonic amusement. "In the matter of widows, Watson," he said dryly, "one must always count twice." The absurdity of the remark, so sudden, so precise, struck me with the full force of its wit, and I could not help but laugh aloud. The walls of Baker Street had borne witness to many such moments, when the grim was tempered by the absurd, and Holmes's peculiar sense of humour emerged from beneath his cloak of severity like a fox from its den. He allowed himself the faintest of smiles, then returned to his seat as if nothing had passed at all. He resumed his previous position, newspaper in hand, and began scanning the obituaries with that curious attention he often reserved for the section most overlooked by others. "There is much to be learned from death, Watson," he murmured, "if one reads between the lines." But his scrutiny was soon interrupted. Mrs. Hudson entered with a yellow envelope, her brows knitted in that way which always signalled urgency, and Holmes took it from her fingers without comment. He tore it open with a fingernail, his eyes flicking across the lines like a man reading music. "A vanished violinist," he said, more to himself than to me. "And a stolen Stradivarius. Scotland Yard, of course, is baffled." I raised an eyebrow. Holmes folded the telegram and tucked it into his dressing gown. "It appears," he said with quiet relish, "that harmony has once again fallen prey to dissonance." The silence lengthened only a moment more before Holmes reached for the matchbox once again. This time, he struck it against the edge of the curtain, a little dramatic flourish I had seen before, but which never ceased to amuse me. The flame caught, his pipe glowed, and his eyes, half-lidded a moment earlier, now glinted with unmistakable clarity. "It begins," I said softly. He inclined his head, acknowledging my deduction with a pleased murmur. "There are few things in life, Watson, more satisfying than the restoration of order where chaos believes itself triumphant." I sipped my tea, now cold, but I hardly minded. Outside, the fog was rising again, thinner now, but ever watchful, and within our little room at 221B, the case of Geoffrey Pellingham was laid gently to rest. But already, within the mind of Sherlock Holmes, another mystery stirred, beckoning with its own music and its own secrets yet to be played. Holmes leaned back in his armchair, the smoke from his pipe curling like a question mark above his head. "You see, Watson," he murmured, There is a curious arithmetic to human motives. One widow mourns a fortune lost, another mourns a father never claimed, yet both wear black for entirely different reasons. I glanced at the folded telegram on the table, its contents already dismissed by that keen mind as child's play. "You almost admire her," I ventured. Holmes's eyes glinted. "I admire precision. And the truth, however emotionally inconvenient, has its own elegance. What do you think? Was the fireplace clue the turning point in Holmes' deductions? Or did the truth begin to unravel much earlier? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this mystery intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe for more cases from Baker Street. Share the story with a fellow sleuth. The game, after all, is far from over.